try to shake me out, but I was born ready. Dropping down the price, then I be getting plenty. They want all your bags and they want all them empty.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman DeGette, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, Ranking Member Griffith, and members of the committee. Thanks so much for having me here to talk about the energy impact of blockchain technology and related cryptocurrency activities, and particularly Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin is important because it introduced the world to the concept of a fully decentralized, secure, trustless system of financial value exchange that turns on proof of work not as a necessary evil, but as a positive feature of its design. And I look forward to exploring these concepts with you today. My name is Brian Brooks, and I spent much of my career in traditional finance, culminating my service as acting U.S. Controller of the Currency. I also served as Chief Legal Officer of Coinbase and currently serve as CEO of Bitfury Group. Bitfury, directly and through our subsidiaries, is one of the most energy-efficient Bitcoin miners in the U.S. and globally. More about that in a few moments. I view the subcommittee's topic today through two lenses. First, in assessing environmental concerns about Bitcoin mining, or frankly any other energy use, not all energy consumption is created equal. Would we care, for example, that an activity consumes a lot of energy if 100% of that energy came from renewable sources? Presumably not. So if Bitcoin consumes an energy mix that is roughly twice as sustainable as the U.S. electric grid as a whole, that is a more relevant fact than the mere amount of energy that it uses. And even more important are the incentives that Bitcoin creates to generate more renewable production. The second lens is, we're a market economy in this country, so we should think deeply about the economic productivity created by Bitcoin or anything else per unit of energy consumed. Thus, for example, if Bitcoin competes as a store of value with gold, does the energy used in Bitcoin mining produce more economic value per unit of energy than gold mining? Or if Bitcoin competes with traditional finance as a means of payment or as a source of credit, does Bitcoin produce more economic value per unit of energy than financial services? The answers might surprise you, as I'll point out in a moment. Now, to be sure, Bitcoin's energy consumption is not trivial, but it is very small compared to many other energy uses that no one questions. Now, I'm not going to belabor the usual comparisons that you hear to clothes dryers or holiday lights or that sort of thing. That would trivialize an issue that the committee's talking about, which is an important issue. But what is clear is that the 188 terawatt hours used by Bitcoin last year, out of about 155,000 terawatt hours consumed globally for all uses, was sourced more sustainably than other uses on average. So, for example, the energy mix used by Bitcoin mining was about 58% sustainably sourced last year, sustainable under the International Energy Agency definition, including wind, hydro, solar, nuclear, and with carbon offsets, compared to 31% for the U.S. energy grid as a whole. And Bitfury's specific numbers are in line with those rough ratios. Now, even more relevant than Bitcoin's current energy use is the incentive effect it has on the future production of renewable energy. Bitcoin miners seek low energy costs, and the lowest cost always comes from excess capacity, which can include wind and solar energy and energy lost in the transmission and distribution process, among other things. As just one example, in 2020, in California, where I live, 1.5 million megawatt hours of solar production was curtailed, meaning wasted, because production exceeded demand. And the U.S. grid loses literally thousands of terawatts a year due to inefficient transmission. Now, because Bitcoin miners are easily able to locate near the source of production, these kinds of excess capacity sources can be turned into economic value through Bitcoin mining. And this has the effect of taking what can be an unprofitable business, for example, solar, and making it profitable. Put differently, if we want more wind and solar in this country with less need for government subsidy, Bitcoin can be part of the solution. Now, Bitcoin mining produces a series of other secondary effects which I detail in my written testimony. These include grid stabilization, incentives to improve ASIC chip efficiency by multiple orders of magnitude, and new technology development for things like immersion cooling, something that my company has innovated. Now, an idea sometimes circulates that somehow we could have all of the positives without the energy usage if we would just abolish proof of work and migrate blockchains exclusively to proof of stake protocols. As I noted in my written testimony, proof of stake is terrific, but it is not a substitute for proof of work, which exists for an entirely different set of purposes, and without which innovations like decentralized finance would likely not exist. Let me just conclude by comparing Bitcoin to the economic value of other uses of energy, because that ultimately is the question for the committee. Bitcoin uses a certain amount of electricity to produce $1 trillion of value. And what you will find, as noted in some of my testimony, is that the aviation industry uses something like 50 times more energy per unit of value than does Bitcoin. The global financial services and insurance industry uses roughly the same amount of energy per unit. And you will note there's a little bit of glitchy data at the very end of my written testimony, which you've corrected now in the record. But I look forward to talking to you about the economic framework within which energy usage for Bitcoin mining and other usages ought to be talked about. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the discussion.
I want to ask a question of Mr. Brooks, because I guess I have two questions. Number one, do you agree that proof of work can be wasteful? And also, very briefly, why do you think that, for example, Bitcoin and these other cryptocurrencies cannot shift to the proof of stake method?
Chairwoman DeGette, thanks for the question. Those are both great questions. I begin with the measure of waste in an economic activity is whether the activity is producing value that other people are willing to pay for. And so Bitcoin is vastly the largest cryptocurrency by market capitalization by a huge amount. And, over the last 6 months has varied between $800 billion and $1.2 trillion. So I begin by saying it's clearly not wasted. It's an asset that large numbers of people are willing to pay for a variety of reasons we could talk about. In terms of whether there's an alternative, whether we could just shift to proof of stake or do this a different way, the problem with proof of stake versus proof of work is that proof of stake, though it is a set of very, very valuable innovations, has at its core a dependence on trust of who the stakeholders are. The original vision of Bitcoin was, this is the only trustless network, so I don't have to care who my counterparty is or who the major shareholders are. The next Bitcoin is given out based on a lottery, right? So in a proof of stake network, 51% of the ownership of that network can rewrite the ledger, can steal everybody else's money, can change the code in ways that are not favorable to the minority shareholders, just like they could in a business corporation. That's not possible in Bitcoin because of proof of work.
I've got to stop. Mr. Brooks, I'm so sorry. I've got to stop you because we're out of time, but I know we're going to want to explore that.
Congress also should not be in the business of picking winners and losers. We should remain impartial when discussing different consensus mechanisms, whether it's proof of work or proof of stake or others. It's not accurate to say at the present time one is simply better than the other. We let the market decide those things. Energy generation in the United States has increased dramatically to meet a growing economy. We're going to need to continue that growth to remain competitive in the world stage. However, Bitcoin has some features built into this protocol, which actually, like the halving cycle, which seems to help it reach an energy equilibrium. The next halving is, I think, in 2024. Can you elaborate on that point some for us so that we understand that miners that are less efficient, that spend more on their energy, they're not going to be successful in the long run?
Well, Mr. Dunn, that's a very insightful comment. And people who work in the mining space look at the halving as the sign of sort of the next value increase in crypto. And so what happens around every halving is the compute network difficulty necessary to find the next Bitcoin goes up, which means that the value of the next Bitcoin goes up, but only the most efficient miners can survive. So one of the positive incentives that I outline in my written testimony about Bitcoin mining in general is the incentive it creates to find more and more energy efficient ways of doing that activity, which, by the way, have massive spillover effects to other sectors outside of crypto. I point to immersion cooling, for example, as something that reduces an enormous amount of energy cost, first in Bitcoin mining, but now in high-performance computing data centers globally, which we wouldn't have but for the halving incentive that you talked about.
We're seeing much more interest in producing ultra-low voltage ASIC chips and whatnot. What are you seeing in that area?
Well, so we've been creating ASIC chips at Bitfury since 2013. We're on our 8th generation of ASIC chip this year. The energy improvement from 2013 to 2022 at Bitfury alone is, wait for it, 6,100%. And the pioneering of those kinds of quantum leap, order of magnitude efficiency gains are shared across all of computing, so not just on Bitcoin mining. It is true that our ASIC chips are specialized for that, but we've now spun up an AI chip business based on some of those same learnings. So what I would say is, in the same way the space program created lots of benefits for other things in the world, Bitcoin mining has produced a lot of other fundamental innovations for other parts of the world.
So we spend a lot of time whining about we can't get enough chips. You're helping us with this.
We're on the demand side, that's for sure.
Excellent. So is it accurate to say that the energy used to mine Bitcoin and any of these things in the United States, that energy is produced in a way that is cleaner than it was when it was the mining was being done in China, Kazakhstan, Russia? So my view is, I think, and I want you to tell me, if the goal is to clean up cryptocurrency mining energy, the best thing you can do is move it to the United States.
Well, no question about that. We're twice as efficient as even the U.S. electric grid, let alone the Kazakhstan grid.
Many of the idle mines in my district, coal and limestone predominantly, are deep underground. They have water that's 50 degrees, the air temperature's in the 50s, and an attractive natural coolant for large hot computer systems like data centers and mining of cryptocurrency. Would you agree?
In my legal career, Leader Griffith, I would have said objection leading. Of course I agree.
That's what I love about this committee. I get to lead.
Bitcoin mining. Listen, Bitcoin miners are always looking for lower temperature. I mean, a big part of the energy input is cooling costs. That's one of the reasons why Iceland, Canada, and places like that are very attractive sites.
So you would say that we have a real asset in Southwest Virginia if we're trying to repurpose from what we always hear from my colleague who just mentioned reducing coal and so forth. We're trying to repurpose our industry. It was predominantly in a number of my counties, the number one industry. This would be a good way for a win-win, both environmentally and for cryptocurrency. Wouldn't you agree?
Sounds like we should talk after the hearing.
I think we should. I do appreciate that. This begs the question of whether we are rushing to overregulate an industry out of existence. What type of barriers would hurt the mining industry? And again, I'm talking about crypto mining, not coal mining. In this case, what would hurt the industry the most, the mining industry the most?
Well, so Mr. Griffith, several different things I think would be bad. So the first thing would be an outright price discrimination against Bitcoin mining, right? Markets decide what the most valuable use of a megawatt of electricity is, not wise politicians, not bank CEOs, not other people. So if crypto has produced $3 trillion of value, it's not up to any of us to decide if that was rational. That's what large numbers of people spending their own money decided. So if we decided to charge Bitcoin miners more than we charge video gamers or more than we charge retail use of electricity, that's putting our thumb on the scale of markets, so that would be bad. It would also be bad to assume that the entire value of Bitcoin, for example, is measured just by the market cap of Bitcoin. Because in fact, the transaction throughput on the Bitcoin blockchain is many, many times, many multiples of the Bitcoin market cap. And that's because the network that is Bitcoin has all kinds of transaction layers built on top of it, the Lightning Network being the most famous. That's transacting hundreds of billions of dollars of transactions every day using the Bitcoin blockchain. And so thinking that the cost benefit that this committee thinks about is limited to the market cap would be a big mistake. So that would be a problem. And finally, although a little bit more of a financial services committee than an energy and commerce committee issue, Bitcoin is the reference asset for most decentralized finance. So if you want to go and get 8% at BlockFi or 4% at Genesis or someplace else, the way that rate of return is being generated is because of Bitcoin trading going on in the background. So if Bitcoin as the bedrock of the entire crypto ecosystem went away, a lot of the rest of these Web3 innovations would also go away. So failing to recognize that connection would be a problem.
And Mr. Jules, your testimony acknowledges that consuming excess electricity from renewables is, and I quote, certainly more desirable than use of less sustainable alternatives. However, you also talk about some of the opportunity costs of this approach. So can you expand on those opportunity costs, please?
Well, I'm not an energy expert. I can mention a few. There are various forms of high-performance computing, such as drug discovery. One could smelt bauxite, for instance, an energy-intensive operation. But if you don't mind, Congressman, actually, I would like to correct the record with respect to a claim that was made earlier that I think is quite relevant to this point. It was noted earlier that mining machines are becoming more energy efficient, and that is absolutely the case, but also an extremely deceptive claim in my view. Mining rigs are not like the light bulbs in our house, where more efficiency means less electricity used. So to be clear, individual mining rigs are growing more energy efficient, but crypto mining as a whole is becoming less energy efficient. And that's because rewards and therefore profits aren't determined by absolute mining power, but by mining power relative to your competitors. So mining rigs have grown more energy efficient over time, and one can see this with reference to the data, but overall energy consumption in crypto mining has been growing over time, particularly over the past year. So in short, more efficient mining equipment does not mean a more efficient Bitcoin network. And I apologize for not answering your question at greater length. I did want to make that point. Thank you.
Thank you. And why do you believe there are still better ways to be using this excess energy?
Because, as I mentioned earlier, proof of work is unnecessary for the maintenance of blockchains. Proof of stake is a perfectly viable alternative that's already securing hundreds of billions of dollars in value. So earlier it was claimed that proof of stake is not as secure as proof of work because of a largely theoretical concern about proof of work validators, as they're called, being able to wipe the blockchain clean. But as I said, that's a theoretical concern. It makes certain suppositions that are not plausible in my technical view. And additionally, in practice, it has not proven significant. So, as I said, we have a viable alternative that uses essentially the amount of energy for a large network that would be required would be that comparable to a small village rather than an entire nation. So in that sense, there are better uses for the energy that's being poured into the Bitcoin network. We can redirect it to almost anything else if we shift the energy sources being used to maintain blockchains today to something that consumes a negligible amount of energy.
Thank you very much. I also had a question for you, Mr. Wright, but I see I'm out of time. So we'll get.
Can you tell me what developments there have been in terms of computing efficiency that could reduce power consumption? How does that work?
Sure. Well, so thank you very much, Congressman, for the question. So the first thing is that in every generation of equipment, and when I say equipment here, I'm really talking about specialized ASIC chips, in order to make Bitcoin profitable at all. So if we were still running the chips from 3 generations ago, say from 5, 6, 7 years ago, the profitability of the activity would be far less than it is with much more efficient chips. So, sort of to speak to the point that was made a moment ago by my fellow panelists, the idea that somehow the system is less efficient, even though the chips are more efficient, sort of doesn't make sense. The system may use more energy. That's a feature of the Bitcoin blockchain for good reasons that I outlined in my written testimony. But the system is clearly more efficient in that it is consuming less energy per, it's X joules per terahash is sort of the measure, and we are hundreds, even thousands of % more efficient than that. The point I was making earlier, though, is other parts of the economy benefit from those fundamental innovations. So Bitcoin mining is not the only place that low voltage ASIC design is used, nor is immersion cooling only used in Bitcoin mining. And yet, because of the economic incentives created by Bitcoin mining, those energy saving innovations were developed and are now being used in other parts of the economy. So my point is that we learn about energy efficiency in a relatively energy-intensive space like Bitcoin mining, and then the broader economy benefits from that as those knock-on effects are felt elsewhere.
Mr. Jules, let me come back to you because I was going to come back to the distinction that you drew between efficiency of the units and the network as a whole. I didn't understand because it seems to me what Mr. Brooks said was right, that if you have units that are individually more efficient, they would aggregate to a more efficient network. I thought the point you were making was that the network just got so bigger that the amount of energy that we're using is not used. Am I missing something there?
So the point was made earlier that the network is becoming more efficient in terms of the amount of energy needed per terahash, for instance.
Right.
But end users don't care about terahashes. End users care about the number of transactions the system is processing. And the number of transactions that the Bitcoin network is processing has remained fairly steady over its lifetime, about 5 transactions a second, which is relatively minuscule for a global payment processing network. The amount of energy consumed by the Bitcoin network as a whole has grown over time. So the amount of energy that this system, which is performing 5 transactions a second, has been consuming, has grown over time. And in that sense, it is less efficient. There's more energy per transaction being consumed by the network now than there was, for instance, a year ago. Now, reference was made to, for instance, the Lightning Network, which is a second layer technology that in principle can increase the transaction rate of the Bitcoin network. But it's really in its infancy, and it remains to be seen how successful it is. And it's not used by a terribly large fraction of end users at this point. I hope that answers your question.
I think so. You're doing sort of using a different denominator, it sounds like.
A key underpinning of blockchain technology generally is the decentralized nature of the network. And in cryptocurrencies, the security and accuracy of transactions is achieved through this decentralization. However, the Bitcoin mining industry has become increasingly consolidated. Estimates have suggested that as few as 50 Bitcoin miners control half of the mining capacity globally. My first question is for you, Mr. Brooks. What are the implications for the Bitcoin network if fewer players control an increasing amount of the mining activity?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for that question. One of the distinctions between the Bitcoin blockchain and proof-of-stake networks is it matters less in the proof-of-work context, the number of miners that exist, because it's not as though the miners can simply collude and choose to alter the Bitcoin blockchain the way that you could on a proof-of-stake blockchain. In a proof-of-work system, you're receiving Bitcoin rewards randomly, right? Because there's a lottery going on. And I think this is one of the most confusing and perhaps most misunderstood aspects of Bitcoin. What goes on is not that there is a correct answer about validating all of the transactions on the blockchain and some miner is figuring out the correct answer. What happens is there's a puzzle that has no correlation at all to the underlying transactions, and whoever gets the right answer first is part of a lottery ticket winner who gets that reward. That's how it's different. So I can't collude with Riot and Marathon and the other biggest miners and decide to alter the blockchain. I could do that, however, on a proof-of-stake network, just like I could in corporate America. I could be a corporate raider and round up a majority of the shares and take over the company and oppress the minority shareholders. That's why proof of work, one of the reasons why proof of work is a good thing, because it prevents that.
Yeah. So, Professor Jules, your work in the field of computer science helped underpin the proof of work blockchains that we see today, but you are a proponent of alternative methods such as proof of stake. And one of the major criticisms often levied at proof of stake networks is around the issue of consolidation. So Professor Jules, is there consensus in academia or in industry around the viability of proof of stake as an alternative to proof of work based mining? And if not, why not?
Excellent question. The question of trust in stakeholders and the degree of centralization in a blockchain isn't mainly a function whether proof of work or proof of stake is used. It's a question of the dynamics of the network. Centralization is a systemic problem. It's affecting essentially all blockchains today. And it's something that the industry is working to reduce. The claim that proof of work somehow provides protection against centralization simply isn't correct. And the claim that proof of stake miners can somehow manipulate the system more effectively than proof of work relies, as I mentioned earlier, on a theoretical consideration that really hasn't proven to be of importance in practice. There are concerns about the rich getting richer in proof of stake systems, but this too is a systemic problem. A study recently by faculty at MIT in the London School of Economics showed, for instance, that 0.01% of the wallets in Bitcoin control 27% of the Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin isn't an egalitarian system. Bitcoin is not the worst blockchain in this respect. Bitcoin is a wonderful technology, and it, I have the greatest respect for its creators and for that community. But there are systemic problems that have nothing to do with whether proof of work or proof of stake is used. Proof of stake is a viable technology. As I mentioned, it has proven its viability in securing hundreds of billions of dollars of value in a very adversarial environment, by which I mean that if somebody can hack proof of stake, or could have hacked proof of stake, that person or entity could have made a lot of money. But that hasn't happened, and that's testimony to the robustness of proof of stake. Proof of work is equally robust, but unfortunately consumes an enormous amount of electricity.
So a common criticism of proof of stake, which Mr. Brooks has already made, is that it's less secure primarily due to some of these consolidation issues. So Professor Jules, do proof-of-stake networks pose security concerns if their mining industries become more consolidated?
Any blockchain that becomes centralized, whether it's proof of work or proof of stake system, poses a threat to the security of the system in that the miners can in principle take over the system. Today, the Bitcoin blockchain can in principle be controlled by a set of 4 entities. They're known as mining pools. If they collaborate, they can in principle spend the same coins twice or cause the network to simply stop processing transactions. So the idea that proof of stake protects against this problem is simply not true. And in fact, there have been that proof of work protects against this problem is simply not true. There have been proof of work systems. Ethereum Classic is one example, Bitcoin Gold, a Bitcoin spinoff, is another, that have been successfully attacked by people who rented hash power and took over the network by devoting more resources to the network than the other miners there. So again, proof of work does not provide definitive or inherent protection against centralization, and we've seen that in practice. Proof of stake, as I said, does raise some concerns about the rich getting richer, but that's not really a function of the use of proof of stake. There are scientific papers suggesting that it's really a question of how the system is calibrated or parameterized.
Mr. Brooks, you were the acting comptroller of currency. I know you worked on some innovative issues while you were in that position and have seen this from a government perspective. What do you think are some things the government should be considering when developing ideas on how to encourage less energy-intensive efforts?
Well, Mr. Soto, thank you for the question, and thanks for all of your focus on this issue over the years. You're one of the real leaders in Congress on it, and I know that you've been a huge intellectual source of support. What I would say is it's important to let markets and price signals work. And so when I hear policymakers, whether they're bank regulators or energy regulators or members of Congress, talk about whether this is a good use of energy, you know, in my sort of Chicago school way of thinking, the best way to allocate energy is based on where the highest value user is. And so, you know, we have a certain energy mix on our grid. It's 24% coal, it's X% solar, it's Y% natural gas, and other kinds of things. That's for a whole set of reasons having to do with transmission costs, you know, mining costs, exploration costs, and those kinds of things. Bitcoin at some level in particular is like an energy derivative. It provides real-time price signals to the market about the most valuable use of energy in a given place. And I'll tell you the way I think about it in my current role. My current role, we virtually only deploy mining in joint ventures with utility providers or renewable providers. We don't go and buy a power plant and burn coal to support our Bitcoin mining. We talk to energy utility X, wind farm Y, and we build these things with them precisely because they can only make the economics work if there's a baseload consumer there, and that's almost always Bitcoin mining. So what I would tell you is there are interesting anecdotal stories of some small mining shop that buys a plant somewhere, and that might not be a good thing. I'm not defending that at all. But the vast majority of industrial scale Bitcoin miners are the price transmission belt for all of energy globally. And so all of our projects are, some utility says we can't build another plant unless you will come and be our interruptible source of baseload consumption. That's the beauty of Bitcoin mining.
Thank you, and my time has expired.
Like phonics, I be getting bags all day, to be honest. I don't got no time to be dealing with no nonsense. I be in my rocket, bags, I'm staying on it. I'm locked in, and you a pawn and a puppet. They got strings and a hand up, and you love it. Samurai switching souls, chopping off heads. I don't hear no FUD no more, it's all dead. Look up in the sky, rockets keep skying. Look up in the sky, bag man flying. Samurai switching souls, chopping off heads. I don't hear no FUD no more, it's all dead. Ay, look up in the sky, rockets keep skying. Look up in the sky, bag man flying. Waiting on the pump.